Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast of the first lesson of the year. Um, the purpose of this is primarily for those who were absent and trying not to fall behind at the beginning of the school year. If you are in class, you've already got all of this, so this is not something you need to worry about unless you want to review. But to begin with, the big thing about history is we're studying the past allegedly, but another way to think about it though is really how did we get to where we are now? So if we start with now, how on earth did we get to where we are? To answer that question though, there are three tools that we're going to focus on for the next three lessons. The first of these is time. And there's a thing called chronology, putting things in the right time order. And the main way we do that is with timelines. That's what we're going to focus on today. But tomorrow we'll also look at space. And cartography is the science of constructing maps, which is a primary way we think of space when we talk about world history. But geography is labeling the things that we put on those maps. What are we focusing on? And there's a various series of types of geography that are important in different ways at different times. And then finally, themes. This is the third in the series of lessons. If you take a given human community at any point in any place in world history, how do you actually study what that community is doing? And the answer to that is through something we will call the Spice T chart, which is the primary way we'll do that. Again, that'll be something we'll get into in the third lesson. So today what we're focusing on primarily is chronology, and that involves using this timeline. This is the first of the PDFs that's attached if you were absent. Again, if you were present in class, you've already done all of this. But one thing I want you to notice is that word timeline over that big vertical line right in the center. And the reason for that is we've got to set up our timeline. So that big vertical line that has timeline underneath it, here's what I want you to do first. Underneath that big line, write the number 0. But when you do that, I want you to think about what exactly does that mean? So it's going to look like this when you put that 0 there. Why do we put our 0 there? Well, in our tradition, that is the time of Jesus. However, there's some problems with that. First of all, is that when Jesus is born? Is that when Jesus dies? Is that when, if you are a Christian, you think Jesus was resurrected? It's not real clear. Moreover, we don't know exactly what the date was when any of those things happened. Nonetheless, our tradition, we put the 0 there to represent the time of Jesus. It's important to note, though, that's not the only way to do it. For example, in the Muslim calendar throughout the Islamic world, which is a giant chunk of the world, the year is actually not 2022, but 1443. And the reason for that is they put their 0 at the time when Muhammad is forced to flee his hometown of Mecca and moves to Medina, something called the Hijra, which we'll learn about later on. In the traditional Chinese calendar, however, the year is not 2022, but 4659. And the reason for that is they put their 0 at a time of a legendary king, the Yellow King that may or may not have existed, to be frank with you. But according to their reckoning, the 0 is way before ours. Nonetheless, that's where we put our 0 in our current understanding of time. There's another alternative to this, though, and that is not even putting it on a line at all, instead of thinking of it as circular. And this is a demonstration of the calendar that is used, or was used, I should say, in the Mesoamerican civilizations before the Spanish conquest. They think of time as a series of interlocking circles. So if you look at how the time unfolds for them, it's not going in one direction. Instead, there's a series of changes that are happening at various points, but always in a circle. There is no beginning and there is no end. So here's what I want you to do on the timeline next. Find the arrows with the dotted lines above the timeline. So like that's the immediately above. And you'll notice there's arrows pointing in both directions with dotted lines, and there's some parentheses there. And in the parentheses, put BC with the dotted arrow pointing left and AD pointing with the dotted arrow to the right. And again, I want you to think about why we are doing what we're doing. So it's going to look like this: BC pointing to the left, AD to the right. Okay, what do those things mean? BC stands for before Christ. AD, while many people think after death, although that's not entirely accurate, it's actually from a Latin phrase, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. I want you to appreciate something about those terms, though. Christ is not Jesus's last name. Jesus from Nazareth is considered Christ for Christians. The word Christ actually means Savior. It's not his last name, and Effin isn't his middle name, I should point out as well. So by actually saying BC, you're calling him Christ, which is a profession of faith, which, while it may be true for the overwhelming majority of people in our particular society, it is certainly not the case throughout the whole world. And for much of world history, it's not even a thing because Jesus didn't exist. Same thing with Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. Well, who calls Jesus Lord? Christians do. Nonetheless, that's been the convention for many, 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 many generations in our particular society. However, I want you to look above that, and you'll notice there are arrows that are straight lines, not dotted. And those also have parentheses. The arrow pointing to the left, I want you to put BCE, and then to the right, CE. But again, let's talk about why and what those mean, and think about what are we doing here. So first of all, here's what your timeline's going to look like. Okay, what do these letters stand for? BCE means before the Common Era. CE means Common Era. Okay, so what's the deal? Well, the deal is, if you notice, the 0 is in exactly the same place. Here's what's going on. First of all, the College Board says we no longer use BC and AD. You'll see them in our text, or in the course of this course, because I'm using some maps or timelines that have an older source, but they're no longer used by the College Board. In the exam that you take at the end of the year, you will not see these things. And so, as an attempt to train you for that, we're not going to use them either. Instead, they're replaced with BCE and CE. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that's just the way the College Board says that it's supposed to be. But I want you to understand why. If calling Jesus Christ is a profession of faith, it doesn't seem quite right for most of human history, and given the fact that a large proportion of the world's population does not practice Christianity, to force people to make that confession of faith. Moreover, though, it would be dumb to change our whole system of understanding time. Like, can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if we just all of a sudden like decided we were getting rid of the 0, or we were going to move the 0? We'd have to instantly change all of our dates. That would be ridiculous. And so BCE and CE are a type of compromise. Like, let's acknowledge that not everybody in the whole world is a Christian, but on the other hand, let's not change the zero because we don't really want to do that. Okay, so there's a logic to it. There's a reason besides just the fact that the College Board says that we have to do that. So we will proceed for the rest of this year using BCE before the Common Era and Common Era, but the zero stays the same. Okay, now let's get into actually putting stuff on there. Well, what about all of those vertical lines in between? If you find the vertical line at the far right of the page, put 200 below that. Now, obviously, that's in the common era. In other words, that's to the right of the zero. And you're going to see that is a huge difference. So what exactly does that represent? Well, that represents the year 2000 of the common era. Okay? So if you think about, well, where are we right now, 2022, we're a little bit to the right of that particular line. But now what I want you to think about is you've got 0 in the center and then 2000 to the right. How are you going to label those vertical lines that come in between? And how did you determine that? Well, the way that you're going to do it is in increments of 500. So if you're going from right to left, 1500, 1500, 0. Now, I don't know how you figured that out. Most people would look at that and go, oh, there's 4 lines from 0 to 2000, and that's 2000 years, so they must be chunks of 500. Dividing 2000 by 4 is going to give you 500. That's one way to do it, a mathematical way. But as we'll see, there's multiple ways of thinking about how to get at the right conclusion. For example, to me, the way I look at that is that line that's labeled 1000 is halfway between, so I know that's the halfway mark, and then I look, oh, those are halfway again, halfway again. It doesn't matter how you get the right answer because there's different ways. Most people, as we'll see in the next few minutes, do this mathematically, but that's not the only way to do it. Okay, cool. So now we're on the right side of the 0. What about what's going on the left side of 0? In other words, before the Common Era. Guys, it's going to get weird. On the left side of the 0, things are a little bit different, okay? If you know every vertical line is a chunk of 500 years, how did you know that you should label them moving progressively from 0 to the left up? In other words, how do you know that the time, the dates get bigger, the numbers of the dates get bigger when you go left? So if you did your timeline while I was talking about this, you're going to notice that it looks like this. What's weird about before the Common Era, in other words, the time before 0, is the number is bigger the further back you go, which is the opposite of the Common Era. This is going to have implications of a large degree, as we'll see here in just a moment. Okay, now we really have our timeline all set up. Let's put stuff on there. The main way that we do this is through absolute dates. This is just a common point in time. Everybody knows it. It's not that hard. For example, when did Columbus discover America, allegedly? You guys all remember 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But let's remember, we're talking about the Common Era. In other words, we're on the right side of the 0. So here's what I want you to do. Put that on your timeline and label it. How do you do that? Well, 1492, you got to find where that is first, and that's just to the left of 1500, right? So put a dot there. Now, yeah, it looks like a square on the PowerPoint, but put a dot there, a big dot. Below it, 1492 of the Common Era. We're acknowledging we're on the right side of the zero. That's when Columbus sails. That's not hard. That's cool. You do this all the time. But I want you to think about this. How many years ago was that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Almost all of you are going to quickly figure out, well, that was 530 years ago. But I want you to stop and think about how you figured that. Because most of you, I'm guessing, will have determined, okay, I took 2022 minus 1492. That's what I got left, 530. But I'm going to tell you, I don't think of it that way. And there are some people, while a minority, that do it differently. I think of it spatially. So if I look at that, I'm thinking, okay, 1500 to 2000 is a chunk of 500. And then I got 8 on the left of 1500 and 22 on the right of 2000. I think of it as chunks of space on the timeline. It doesn't matter how you get to the right answer as long as you get there, but I want you to be aware the way you do it may not be the only way to do it. That was a pretty easy example, but let's consider another one. In 221 BCE, so now we're on the left side of the zero, the weird side of the zero. The first Chinese emperor takes the title emperor. He's the first emperor of many, 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 as we'll see. Chinese empires are a thing that aren't going away for a long time. Okay, if you're placing that on your timeline, where would you put that and how would you label it? Well, 221 BCE is somewhere in between 500 and 0. And it's a little bit more towards the 0 than 250, which would be directly halfway. I put a dot, 221 BCE. Again, we're on the left side of the 0. Qin Shi Huangdi becomes the first emperor, whatever. Okay, cool. But now let me ask you this. How many years ago was that? And how did you figure that? Well, the answer is 2,243 years ago. Now, most of you, I'm guessing, the way that you figured that was 2022 on the right side plus 20 or 221 to the left side equals 2243. Okay, but that's not the only way of doing it. Again, some people do it by looking at the chunks and adding what's left over. But one thing that's weird about this is the year 0. That 0 is not actually a year, right? It's weird because you got to the left, you got to the right, but like it kind of seems like you should add a year to that. Because year 0, shouldn't that be a year long? Which, by the way, that'd be a heck of a year of nothing. But no, that's not the way we do it. It's kind of really odd if you stop and think about this. So this is what your timeline looks like so far. This is the easy stuff. Now we also have a system called approximate dates. These are typically used for things where we can't actually pinpoint exactly when it happened. So a process, for example, where things are happening slowly and you can't exactly say, here's exactly the day where it happened, for example. For example, around 100 of the Common Era, so this would be 100 on the right of the 0, there was an outbreak of disease that spread along this trade route called the Silk Roads. And it would eventually contribute to the end of both the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty. We'll learn much more about those later on. But what I want you to notice right now is that word around. Like, it's not like one day all of a sudden all of Eurasia was like covered in this plague. It's a slow process. So we're talking about an approximate date, around this date. Now, when you put that on your timeline and label it, the 100 CE part is probably not that difficult. But what you need to know now is we use the abbreviation CA, could be capital C or not, it frankly doesn't matter, that comes before the number. And CA is from a Latin word circa, which means around. Why don't we do it, just say AR? I don't know, because it's been this way since before people were speaking primarily English. It means the same thing. We typically say out loud around date, but we write circa CA. So on your timeline, you put the dot. Again, it's going to be like 1/5 of the way between 0 and 500 on the right of 0 because it's common era. But we must write circa to indicate that it's an approximate date. Okay, cool. Around how many years ago was that? How did you determine that? Well, most people, again, would go 2022 minus 100, but please recognize you could also do chunks, 500 chunks or whatever, maybe 1,000, I don't know, and then add what's left on either side. Finally, well, actually, next, we've got another type of dates called relative dates. These are dates relative to now. Okay, so imagine if you didn't have the 0 at all, and right now is 0. We can talk about and put things on a timeline, talking about them in terms of how many years ago they were. And you'll see two different abbreviations for this, YA years ago or BP before present. They're essentially the same thing. They're translating something, looking at it how many years ago from now, and then putting it on the timeline. We do this typically for processes that occurred in the distant past, like a long time ago. It doesn't matter what the date was necessarily. It's important to know how much further from now in the past it was. So, for example, the Neolithic Revolution, when humans began domesticating plants and animals to provide food for them, and they slowly over time stopped having to constantly move to forage for their food, began around 10,000 years before present. Now notice the around, because it didn't happen overnight, and BP, before present. So starting from right now, 10,000 years before now, around 10,000 years, that's when humans started doing this. So the first thing you got to think of is, okay, that's an approximate date, right? Around, so we're using circa. But then the second thing is, okay, what are we doing with that 10,000 number? Well, because it's an approximate date, let's just make this easier on ourselves and start from 2000. Let's go in chunks of thousands of years. It doesn't matter because it's approximate anyways. It's not like it happened overnight. So if you start from 2000 of the Common Era and go back 10,000 years before that, what is the date? To express this fully, we'd have to say circa 8,000 BCE. BCE because we're on the left of 0. 8,000, most of you are going to get that. You go 10,000 and subtract 2,000 because that's what's left, and the circa is required because it's an approximate date. Here's the question though, can you put that on your timeline? I'm betting you very quickly figured out you can't. Why not? Well, because to the left of 0 on our timeline, the last vertical line is 2,000. 8,000 BCE is 4 times as long. Our timeline just doesn't go back that far. So we could express that as a date, but in our particular timeline, we can't even put it on there. Here's another example. Around 3,700 years ago, a king in Mesopotamia, Hammurabi, creates the first written legal code. The first time anybody actually wrote down the laws that we have actual physical evidence of, I should say. But we're not exactly sure when it was. The physical evidence still remains. We don't know exactly when it was created. So it's around 3,700 years ago. It's approximate, so we're going to use circa, but it's relative because it's expressed as years ago. So how do we convert that? In other words, what would be the date around 3,700 years ago? Most of you by now have figured out if you go from 2000 of the Common Era, 2000 to 0, and then 0 and 1700 more to the left, BCE. Circa 1700 BCE is the date, is the expression of the date for something that happened around 3,700 years ago. You can put that on your timeline and label it. Again, we have to put both a circa because we're estimating and the BCE because we're on the left side of the 0. Finally, another way we can think of dates involves a range of dates. These are dates that have a start period and an end period. It happens in this space of time. So, for example, we could think of that as a decade. If you had Coach Saunders for World History last year, you might remember learning about the Roaring 20s with the Jazz Age and the Flapper Girls and all of that stuff. That happens over a period of 10 years, starting in 1920 and going to 1929, hence the term Roaring 20s. We could also think of centuries. The 20th century, for example, was 1900 to 1999. One thing I want you to notice there, though, is it's the 20th century, but it's not the 2000s, it's the 1900s. And the reason for that will become clear if you look closely at the timeline, because the first century of the Common Era was 0 to 99. So the actual start and end date looks like it's behind what we call the century. But we could also do this for millennia, a period of 1,000 years. The second millennium of the Common Era would be 1000 to 199. Again, I'm sorry, 1999. Again, though, it's because the first millennium of the Common Era was 0 to 999. Now, let's think about how we put this on our timeline. In the 13th century of the Common Era, these dudes called the Mongols conquer a huge portion of Eurasia, the largest land empire that ever existed. It happens in the 13th century. Okay, to put this on a timeline, we got to start. Okay, what's the start date and the end date? This is a range of dates. 13th century of the Common Era means it starts in 1200 and it goes to 1299 of the Common Era. In other words, the 13th century is the 1200s. Once you figure that out, add it to your timeline and label it. Now, on the slide, it's going to look like a square. We typically use small vertical lines for these, but you indicate the start date, you indicate the end date, draw a line connecting them, and then you label that. So 1200 CE to 1299 CE, 13th century, that's the Mongol conquest. Well, that's not so difficult, but let's consider another example. In the 5th century BCE is when the Greek Golden Age happens in the city-state of Athens. This is when almost all of that philosophy and poetry and drama and architecture, all these things we think of when we think of classical Greece, happens in this 1 century. But notice it's BCE. It's on the left of the zero. Things get weird on the left of the zero. Why? Well, because think about it. Here's our first task. What's the start date and what's the end date? In other words, when does the 5th century BCE start? Well, because we're on the other side of the zero, the bigger number is the start date. So it's 499 to 400, not the other way around. It is similar, though, because if you think about it, what's the 1st century BCE? It's 99 to 100. I have a way of trying to demonstrate this in class. If you're not at all clear on this, please ask me outside of class, because I physically can demonstrate a way that makes sense. It probably doesn't on a video, so I'm not even going to bother. How do you label that? Well, your start date is 499, so that's going to be just inside the 500. End date 400. Connect them with a line and then label it. So there we go. Now on the other side of the sheet, or the second part of the PDF, these are the abbreviations you need to know. And if you're watching this at home, take a moment to pause. Off the top of your head, try to list these. If you don't get them, I'm going to go over them in just a moment. How many of these do you remember? Okay, let's look at each of these individually. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for Year of Our Lord. BC, before Christ. Christ again being the title if you believe that Jesus is in fact the Savior who died for your sins. The CE stands for Common Era, and BCE before the Common Era, which is the labels we use now, but that's a recognition that we don't want to change our zero. Before present or years ago are two ways that you'll frequently see relative time. CA before a date means circa, which is Latin for around. That's when we're given a ballpark estimate. Capital C after the number means century. Now, make sure you've got these terms. They're in a Quizlet you'll study later on, but one final point I want to make about these. Remember that these first two are not used by the College Board, and in point of fact, they're not used by almost all historians throughout the world. There are some people that still use them, but they are a tiny, tiny minority. You will see them in this course primarily because I'm using maps from a time before that was the convention. Common Era and before the Common Era are what we will use for our absolute dates in this course. Relative dates, meaning years relative to now, And then approximate dates must have circa, whether they're absolute or relative. You have to put that before the date if you're given it a ballpark. And the most common way we see range of dates is with century. Now, in class, there was an exit slip. If you were absent, you do not have to do the exit slip. However, you should be able to answer the following questions. First, convert these to absolute dates. So, what exactly was the date 500 years before present? And what was the date exactly 3,000 years ago? Now, you could use your timeline to answer this. Some people use their calculators to answer this. Don't Google it, but you should be able to answer these. The opposite then is converting relative dates to absolute dates. So, how many years ago was 800 CE? How many years ago was 2000 BCE? The Industrial Revolution began around 270 years before present. How would you express this as an approximate date? Around, you'll notice is in italics. You must have that abbreviation there. In this case, 270 years go from 2020 is the easiest way to do it because it's not that long ago. And then there was a bonus question. The first Mesopotamian cities in the world, the first cities in the world, begin to emerge in the 5th millennium BCE. Now, this one was tricky. How would you express this as a range of dates? In other words, what's the start date and the end date of the 5th millennium BCE? The trick there is we're on the left side of the zero, BCE. If you feel pretty confident you got these, you're cool. If you're totally lost, please come and see me outside of class. Again, the purpose of this video was primarily just so you don't get too far left behind. I think a lot of this, though, as we go throughout the course, you're going to pick up. Thank you very much for putting in the effort in the first place, especially if you were absent. I will point out on Schoology, there is another homework assignment. It's a reading passage in the form of a PDF that has certain questions for you to answer. Now, the students that are in class are going to write those right physically on there. You might be able to use Cami or you could print them out, however you want to do it. There's also a short video clip that is not required but highly recommended. It is going to make it a whole lot easier for you to answer the last two questions out of those five. Whatever you do, though, I'm begging you, please don't Google it. You're going to find out. We'll talk more about this on Friday. I'm trusting you guys a whole lot. But Googling it is not helping you. You may think it is because you get an answer, but it's not helping you develop the skills you need. Regardless, though, I want you to know how much I appreciate you. I apologize. This is a kind of long video. Typically, I try to keep the videos under a half hour. I got a bit over on this one. But again, I am grateful for your effort. One way or another, I hope that I see you in class soon. In the meantime, take care and thank you again.